Hi, welcome to CHI's Unlearning Our Loneliness. This is week one of this particular course, uh, Becoming Considerate. We'll be looking at David Foster Wallace's essay, Consider the Lobster, and learning a little bit about love. Uh, just as a bit of review, I'll go through what we studied over the summer to kind of give a context for what this next 7 weeks is going to be. So during the summer session, we read through Plato's Symposium and encountered some of the following. Number one, most theories are selfish. One defines love in ways that make the self seem lovable, loving, or justified in how one approaches love. So in reading through the speeches, that was one thing that kind of came up time and time again. Number two, theories of love hold in tension perspectives that arise from the desires of the flesh and ones that descend from the virtues of the mind. One shorthand way to describe this tension is between poles like the finite and the infinite, the universal and particular, bodies and language. I mean, there are a lot of those kinds of dichotomies that you can string together, but they all try to hold that general tension in mind. Number three, in his speech in the symposium, Socrates posited that love is mediation. Love is neither one thing nor another, but it's that which bridges and connects those two kinds of extremes. He argued that love should function in an expansive way that moves from one particular body to contemplation of the good and beauty at its most abstracted forms. So for Socrates, that was the goal of love. Number four, many theories of love posit that part of its value is helping lovers become better people, more fulfilled at an individual level and more noble on a social level. Socrates believed that this would only come through the desire for the good spawned by love. So love attracts us to the good, being attracted to the good and pursuing it makes us just better overall. Number five, most theories of love also incorporate an element of time. What love lacks is security in the future. Love wishes to attain certainty, and there are benefits to long-term relationships that deepen and evolve, so long as one chooses one's partner wisely. Having a long-term relationship with somebody who's vicious will probably deteriorate your character in that regard. And number six, we concluded the summer session by looking at the final speech in the symposium offered by Alcibiades, whom Socrates had rejected as a lover, to show the need for love's particularity and its consummation. I used the speech to argue that love is an interruption of one's plans for life, that life interrupts what love allows one to desire, and that heartbreak is more common than the type of fulfilling love that the other speeches described. Love isn't easy. If it happens at all, it's hard work. And so that's how we ended the summer session. In terms of a course preview, this fall we'll be looking at a number of different short stories and essays that posit the difficulty of love in different ways. Each thing that we read each week will offer a different lesson concerning how to unlearn loneliness, if only by offering examples of how loneliness continues within the space of a relationship. Few of the stories, I should warn, have happy endings. I mean, it's not going to be that kind of class. I know. But this reflects human life, I think. All relationships end, eventually, if only with death, and they continue forward with difficulty and uncertainty. Nothing's easy in human life. Few relationships are unambiguous in their desirability because they're with other humans who are just as fickle as we are. It makes it hard. And so that's what we'll be exploring in the next 7 weeks today for the next 6 following. So in terms of today, we'll focus, as I said, on David Foster Wallace's famous essay, Consider the Lobster. It's a nonfiction piece, not a short story. It's also not ostensibly, primarily, or even generally concerned with the topic of love. How many of you were confused when you were reading a class for a love class, and you have this whole thing about a lobster and cooking, and you have no idea what the heck is going on? We'll get there. I think I have a case for why it's important. We'll see if you agree with that in class. But in reading through the essay, I'm hoping to pursue the question of how an ability to consider the lobster may help us to unlearn our loneliness in ways that we don't expect. So that's what we'll be spending the next 45 or so minutes doing. Sound okay? All right. So the tone of the essay is pretty clearly set by the first sentence. He writes, quote, "The enormous, pungent, and extremely well-marketed Maine Lobster Festival is held every late July in the state's mid-coast region, meaning the western side of Penobscot Bay, the nerve stem of Maine's lobster industry." Wallace's ambivalence is clear. Enormous isn't necessarily a positive attribute. Pungent certainly is not. and extremely well marketed, damns with very faint praise. The focus of the first sentence is on the economics of the festival more than anything else. It exists for the sake of money. He clarifies this in the second paragraph. Quote, tourism and lobster are the Mid-Coast region's two main industries, and they're both warm weather enterprises, and the main lobster festival represents less an intersection of the industries than a deliberate collision, joyful and lucrative and loud. The assigned subject of this article is the 56th annual MLF, whose official theme was Lighthouses, Laughter, and Lobster. Total attendance, paid attendance was over 80,000, due partly to a national CNN spot in June, during which a senior editor of a certain other Epicurean magazine hailed the MLF as one of the best food-themed festivals in the world. Now, the joyful and lucrative and loud collision of industries once again positions this festival in a strictly pecuniary light. It's a savvy move. David Foster Wallace is also a fan of noting the scale of the festival, including the, quote, MLF's main eating tent, where something over 25,000 pounds of fresh-caught Maine lobster is consumed after preparation in the world's largest lobster cooker near the ground's north entrance. It's a lot of food. It's a lot of lobster. It's a lot to consider. So, his disdain for the facts of the festival seems fitting with his character, which Jason Segel does a really good job, I think, of capturing in the movie The End of the Tour. The film team is going to be showing it again in a couple weeks if you didn't see it. But if you like the essay, if you like the way that David Foster Wallace writes, I considered going to the film scene and checking out the movie. I thought it was well done. In any case, his choice is to focus on the lobster itself. The shift in tone occurs in the third paragraph. He writes, quote, for practical purposes, everyone knows what a lobster is. As usual, though, there's more to know than what most of us care about. It's all a matter of what your interests are. Instantly, he draws our attention to the practical purpose of the lobster, which is to what?
Cook it.
Cook it, eat it, right? Practically, that's what a lobster is. It's food. But from here, he begins to consider the taxidermy, the etymology, the taxonomy, all of the things about the species that nobody bothers to consider for the most part. After a lot of scientific information, he gets to the point. Quote, lobsters are basically giant sea insects. It's a nice consideration. Nonetheless, he says, they are themselves good eating. The reader is not left, however, with anything that could be grabbed as a blurb for future festivals. Instead, he continues by offering another lesson on economics fixed on the particular case of the lobster. And I'll read this paragraph starting at the beginning. Quote, but they themselves are good eating, or so we think now. Up until sometime in the 1800s, the lobster was literally low-class food, eaten only by the poor and institutionalized. Even in the harsh penal environment of early America, some colonies had laws against feeding lobsters to inmates more than once a week because it was thought to be cruel and unusual. One reason for the low status was how plentiful lobsters were in old New England. Unbelievable abundance is how one source describes the situation. Pre-modern lobster is often cooked dead and then preserved, usually packed in salt or crude hermetic containers. Maine's earliest lobster was shipped as far away as California in demand only because it was cheap and high in protein, basically chewable fuel. That's the lobster. From this historical perspective, David Foster Wallace reveals the importance of a good PR firm in terms that could only be taken from a menu. So here's where he continues. Now, of course, lobster is posh, a delicacy, only a step or two down from caviar. The meat is richer and more substantial than most fish. Its taste subtle compared to the marine gaminess of mussels and clams. Lobsters is now the seafood analog to steak, with which it's so often twinned as surf and turf and the really expensive part of the chain steakhouse menu. After a few more snarky remarks about the festival, the narrator once again prompts readers to consider the lobster. I mean, he's just really attending to it and attending to all the ways that it pops up in culture. So he comes back to it again. Lobster is essentially a summer food. This is because we now prefer our lobsters fresh, which means they have to be recently caught. Chitinous arthropods grow by molting, rather the way that people have to buy bigger clothes as they age and gain weight. Since lobsters can live to be over 100, they can also get to be quite large, as in 20 pounds or more, though truly senior lobsters are rare now because New England's waters are so heavily trapped. For the first time in the essay, the narrator points us to the fact that our appetite for lobsters has an effect on them. They die. Senior lobsters are limited due to trapping. Very few of them make it to a ripe old age. We eat them to death. Things become far more blatant, though, in the next paragraph, as he juxtaposes the life of a creature given human consumptions with the fact of it as a merely consumable entity without additional purpose. As an a la carte entree, lobster can be baked, broiled, steamed, grilled, sauteed, stir-fried, or microwaved. The most common method, however, though, is boiling. If you're someone who enjoys having lobster at home, this is probably the way you do it. And again, he uses the second person here. You do it. Since boiling is so easy, you need a large kettle with a cover, which you fill about half full with water. The standard advice is that you want 2.5 quarts of water per lobster. Get the water boiling, put in the lobsters one at a time, cover the kettle, and bring it up to a boil. The reason that kettle's lobsters turn scarlet is that boiling somehow suppresses every pigment in their chitin but one. If you want an easy test of whether the lobsters are done, try pulling on one of their antennae. If it comes out of the head with minimal effort, you're ready to eat. Bing. How many of you eat lobster? How many of you boil it at home? Does this sound familiar? Okay, you don't do that. All right. Maybe that's just an East Coast thing. I'm not sure. I don't eat the lobster. I've considered it, but I've also considered lobster. Yeah. Wallace doesn't overwrite the paragraph, although it's somewhat jarring to see the ease with which we enjoy lobster be set against the easy test of when the lobster is done, the minimal effort of extracting an antenna. It's a moment when the reality of consuming an alien animal becomes pretty clear. The next paragraph goes into further detail about the cruelty involved in preparing lobster for one's enjoyment. A detail so obvious that most recipes don't even bother to mention it. And again, he's just laying it out so thick. And he does that really nicely. I mean, that's I think, part of what makes Wallace a great writer, is that each lobster is supposed to be alive when you put it in the kettle. This is part of lobster's modern appeal. It's the freshest food there is. They're relatively easy for vendors to keep alive. They come up alive in the traps, they're placed in containers of seawater and can, so long as the water is aerated and the animal's claws are pegged or banded to keep them from tearing one another apart under the stresses of captivity, survive right up until they're boiled. Most of us have been in supermarkets or restaurants that feature tanks of live lobster from which you can pick your supper while it watches you point. And again, there's just that little air of giving the animal some amount of agency, some amount of intelligence and wherewithal that's a little disconcerting. It's a little bit disturbing. But the emphasis throughout is the fact that the lobster is both alive and sentient, right? And he just keeps considering that just really irritating fact. His use of the second person grips the reader. The lobster watches as you pick it. Further, he indicates the stresses of captivity for the first point. The lobster suffers in the name of our ease and enjoyment. The fact that it's obvious, though, seems to have little to do with why a recipe may exclude this fact. After this paragraph, however, David Foster Wallace is ready to confront readers with the explicit question that's formed in his mind, right? So at this point, he finally gets to the point. So then here's a question that's all but unavoidable at the world's largest lobster cooker and may arise in kitchens across the US. Is it all right to boil a sentient creature alive just for our gustatory pleasure? A related set of concerns. Is the previous question irksomely PC or sentimental? What does all right even mean in this context? Is it all just a matter of individual choice? It's a good question to consider, especially when he's considering it in this big write-up of this massive, huge lobster fest, right? Is it all right? And what would all right mean if it is all right? It's an interesting question. So, I'm pretty sure that most people manage to avoid it. He says that it's something that's all but unavoidable. Most people avoid the question, I think, pretty successfully throughout their lobster eating lives. Both at the world's largest lobster cooker and within your own kitchen, I think he's being overly generous to his audience. But it's an ethical question. Is it all right? And he'll softball the question and point to a lack of good framework in which it can be answered, right? He just kind of punts it away and says, we don't need to worry about this one at this point. But he still wants to pursue the question, right? And so he turns to answer it by examining the claims of PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, which, as one would guess, opposes the Maine Lobster Festival. This makes sense, right? Conflict of interest between the two groups. He contrasts their claims, PETA's claims, with the perspective of Dick, quote, our florid and extremely gregarious car rental guy, whose son-in-law is one of the main eating tent's regular suppliers. Now, Dick, quote, articulates what he and his family feel is the crucial mitigating factor in the whole morality of boiling lobsters alive issue. There's a part of the brain in people and animals that lets us feel pain, and lobsters' brains don't have this part. That's Dick's point, right? So here's the human brain. Here's the pain part. That's what humans have. Here's the lobster brain. there's no pain part. Therefore, totally fine to boil them alive, not a problem. Because they don't feel it, right? You're not gonna hurt their feelings, they don't have feelings. They're basically sea insects, that's all they are. So David Foster Wallace notes that Dick's opinion is incorrect in about 11 different ways, but it's far from isolated. He says that it's more or less, quote, more or less echoed by the festival's own pronouncement on lobsters in pain, which is a part of a Test Your Lobster IQ quiz that appears in the 2003 MLF program, courtesy of the Maine Lobster Promotion Council. Like, they don't have any agenda to put that in there at all, right? They say, quote, the nervous system of a lobster is very simple, and it is in fact most similar to the nervous system of the grasshopper. It is decentralized with no brain. There's no cerebral cortex, which in humans is the area of the brain that gives the experience of pain. Now, David Foster Wallace has a few different arguments against this claim. And he goes on for some detail. I'll just summarize it here. Number one, he says pain reception is known to be a part of a much older and more primitive system of nociceptors and prostaglandins that are managed by the brainstem and thalamus. Right? So rather than seeing pain as something highly evolved, it's pretty primitive. So you can't make this like we've evolved into pain. That's not how evolution works. Pain is primitive. Number two, quote, since pain is a totally subjective mental experience, we do not have access to anyone or anything's pain but our own. And this is tricky when it comes to mammalian pets, and then even harder when you get to invertebrates like lobsters, right? I can't understand your pain. You can't understand my pain. There's no way on earth I can understand a lobster's pain because it can't communicate. It just clicks its things, right? I mean, I don't know what that means. I don't hear it scream. I don't know. It can't communicate in a way that I can understand. Number three,
the smallest insect will make defensive moves when it feels it's in danger. That means it values its life.
yeah, and that's, I think you're on the same page as David Foster Wallace. He's getting to that point. But you can't know, right? Because that insect can't tell you, dude, wait, I'm in pain, help me, right? I mean, you can interpret it, but there's a lot of interpretation, just the way that I can interpret your pain. But I mean, if you're doing the pain scale thing, I mean, it's as ridiculous as saying, how in pain are you? I guess I'm in this pain. I mean, it's really hard to translate what pain means among humans, much less between species. Does that make sense? I mean, he's just saying it's hard to tell. You can interpret things, but it's really hard to tell what pain means.
You can see the defensive moves.
Yeah, but you interpret it. I mean, maybe they're just backing up. I don't know.
What if you taught a robot to run away, every time someone poked it? Is the robot in pain?
It could be emotionless instinct, not just.
Yeah. You're right. I'm not disagreeing with you. And I think David Foster Wallace agrees. But the point is, it's hard to communicate pain. It's just hard to just talk about it or describe it or let somebody else know how much pain you're in. You can say, I'm in pain, and say it really loud. I don't know. It's really tough. Number three, the whole animal cruelty and eating issue is not just complex, it's also uncomfortable. As far as I can tell, my own way of dealing with this conflict has been to avoid thinking about the whole unpleasant thing. The 2003 Maine Lobster Fest, several days in the midst of the great mass of Americans all eating lobster, forced David Foster Wallace to, quote, think hard about lobster and the experience of buying and eating lobster, and it turns out that there's no honest way to avoid certain moral questions. Like, if you're gonna be in that environment for that long, you're gonna have to think about it if you're an honest person. I mean, it's kind of dismissive of the people that don't think about it. He didn't really care about dismissing those people. I don't think. He was all right with that. Number four, the fact that killing lobsters is do-it-yourself makes this especially poignant, right? If you're gonna cook them at home, you kill the animal in your kitchen, which is a new level of things than like those little hamburger patties that you get at Hy-Vee or the Bratwurst that are already prepackaged, right? You just take it in the styrofoam thing and you throw it on the grill and it's fine. Lobsters don't work that way. It's super fresh, but you need to kill it. So here's the narrator's description of why this becomes important. He says, quote, the intimacy of the whole thing is maximized at home, which is of course where most lobster gets prepared and eaten. Although note already the semi-conscious euphemism prepared, which in the case of lobsters really means killing them right there in our kitchen. The basic scenario is that we come in from the store and make our little preparations, like getting the kettle filled and boiling, and then we lift the lobsters out of the bag or whatever retail container they came home in, whereupon some uncomfortable things start to happen. However stuporous the lobster is from the trip home, for instance, it tends to come alarmingly to life when placed in boiling water. This is your insect thing, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's in a daze. If you're in boiling water, it perks up. If you're tilting it from a container into the steaming kettle, the lobster will sometimes try to cling to the container sides, or even to hook its claws over the kettle's rim, like a person trying to keep from going over the edge of a roof. And worse is when the lobster is fully immersed. Even if you cover the kettle and turn away, you can usually hear the cover rattling and clanking as the lobster tries to push it off. Or the creature's claws scraping the sides of the kettle as it thrashes around. The lobster, in other words, behaves very much as you or I would behave if we were plunged in boiling water, with the obvious exception of screaming. A blunter way to say this is that the lobster acts as if it's in terrible pain, causing some cooks to leave the kitchen altogether and to take one of those little lightweight plastic oven timers with them into another room and wait until the whole process is over. Right? So, I mean, he totally agrees with you. It seems like lobsters are in terrible, terrible pain as we boil them alive. Go figure. And this is one person's description of what cooking lobster is like. And even though I can't remember if I've eaten lobster, I don't know. I might have at some point. I've never prepared it myself. I believe that description. It seems like it would make sense, but I've never witnessed it myself. I'm just taking David Foster Wallace's word for what that's like. Is that fair? The narrator then turns to ethics to understand whether or not a living creature has the capacity to suffer. He mentions neurological receptors and behaviors consistent with pain. The problem, at least for those who love lobster, quote, it takes a lot of intellectual gymnastics and behaviorist hair splitting not to see the struggling, thrashing, and lid clattering as just such pain behavior. Other fairly common ways to kill your lobster and achieve maximum freshness involve driving a knife in the head, which is, quote, more violent, but also, quote, shows a willingness to exert personal agency and accept responsibility for stabbing the lobster's head, honors the lobster somehow, and entitles one to eat it. Right? So, I mean, you can boil it alive and run away out of the kitchen while it's screaming in agony. Or you can just, take a knife, stab it through its head, and you've earned it that way. A little bit better. But while it might help us feel better, like we've earned the lobster by killing it directly, Wallace points out that it doesn't really do much for the lobster due to their nervous systems. He provides a lot of information about the lobster's capacity for pain. They feel through hairs in their carapace, and they lack the opioids that block pain, which makes them arguably more vulnerable to pain than mammals are. They feel it even worse than you or I would. This vulnerability seems to hold up in terms of their behaviors. Here's another longer quote from Wallace. Still, after all the abstract intellection, there remain the facts of the frantically clanking lid, the pathetic clinging to the edge of the pot. Standing at the stove, it's hard to deny in any meaningful way that this is a living creature experiencing pain and wishing to avoid or escape the painful experience. To my lay mind, he's dismissing himself a little bit there, the lobster's behavior in the kettle appears to be the expression of a preference. And it may well be that the ability to form preferences is the decisive criterion for suffering. When we assert that worms appear not to be suffering after being cut in half, what we're really saying is that there's no sign that the worms know anything bad has happened or would prefer not to have been cut in half. Lobsters, however, are known to exhibit preferences. And these preferences are subtle and they're nuanced. He describes like how lobsters will go hundreds of miles for a degree or two of water temperature. Like they're incredibly sensitive to very small changes in the water that we wouldn't notice. They do. Boiling water, really bad. They don't like the light. They live deep water. They like it cold. They like it dark. Your kitchen, not a friendly place. But is it wrong? The narrator wants to argue that there's a difference between the maid-eating tent and a medieval torture fest. So here's his argument. Is it not possible that future generations will regard our own present agribusiness and eating practices in much the same way that we now view Nero's entertainments or Aztec sacrifices? My own immediate reaction is that such a comparison is hysterical, extreme, and yet the reason it seems extreme to me appears to be that I believe animals are less morally important than human beings, and when it comes to defending such a belief, even to myself, I have to acknowledge that A, I have an obvious selfish interest in this belief, since I like to eat certain kinds of animals and want to be able to keep doing it, and B, I have not succeeded in working out any personal ethical system in which the belief is truly defensible instead of just selfishly convenient. He's a really human narrator, right? He provides an ambiguous, sympathetic zone for the reader to inhabit. And for the most part, we're probably as comfortable with cognitive dissonance as he is, right? Is there any ethical way that you can defend boiling a lobster alive? Of course not, right? Is that good? No. Does it taste good? Yeah. Are you willing to live with that? Yeah. And that's what he has to do at a certain point, right? He's going to eat animals. Yeah, I'm going to live with that. That's okay. Is it morally defensible? Yeah, let's not consider that too much. But still, he considers the lobster. All right. Any questions about the essay? We have not yet gotten to love. We're getting there. Are there any questions about the essay at this point? Okay. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if I had printed off the wrong assignment.
Oh, no, it's the right one.
Okay.
All right. So here's why I think it's an important way to start off this particular class. There are a few reasons. Number one, at a social level, we're extremely and incredibly comfortable with the thought of causing pain and suffering to other beings. We might feel guilt when we hurt the ones we love, but we're complicit in a lot of death and suffering. The animal world is, of course, big business, but the death, when one does not consider the lobster, is largely disguised. As the narrator explains in the footnotes, we eat beef instead of cow. We eat pork instead of pig. Living in Iowa City gives you a lot of access to animals who have been cared for before they were killed, right? You can get a lot of locally grown, locally raised things that you kill to eat. And it makes it better because it's local, right? And they've been loved before you eat them. That makes it better, right? It feels better in here somehow that you're eating something that was loved, not just like farmed in the factory system. But, I mean, even beyond animals, humans die too, for our convenience. They're the ones who fight wars or fight fires or who do dangerous tasks for us that we don't want to do. We don't really like to think of these things except to say that we're against it. Like, do you ever want to go to war and kill people? No, I'm against it. Like, I don't want to kill anybody. Like, we can be against it in that kind of really loose, conventional way, but it's really convenient for us that other people do that. And they do it for us, to let our lives be a little bit more convenient, to keep our gas prices low, to keep the economy high. People have got to die. It's a new version of human sacrifice. And it goes on even if you're really profoundly opposed. It doesn't matter. It's like the new UI president. You might be really, really opposed. It doesn't matter. The guy's still going to be president. It doesn't matter what you think. But at some level, it's hard for me to believe that we can live in a culture that celebrates ease at the expense of life without it messing up our ability to love. Does that make sense? Number two. I suspect that most of us tend to treat other people with the same kind of casual attitude that we treat lobsters with, especially when human life is described at the same mass scale as the lobsters. Media coverage has a lot to do with this. So when you hear of the thousands who died in a genocide or battle, or the hundreds who died during this natural disaster, it allows us to think of human death and suffering at the level that we posit the lobster. It's a mass scale. It's a bunch of death. And it doesn't matter if it's one death or 100 or 1,000, it just is a big gravestone. And that's all we consider. That's a lot of death. But we can't even think of that much death. We can barely think of one person's death, much less 100 or 10 or 1,000. It's really hard to consider that. And so media sensationalization of mass death desensitizes to us. And it's not that we consider eating the human the way that we consider eating the lobster, right? I'm not arguing that we're cannibalistic, but we're desensitized to thinking of the lives that we don't know personally or particularly, right? It's just death in this abstracted, really general form. This desensitization also makes it difficult for us to love. I think that we're far more prone to continue this level of abstraction even into our intimate affairs. There's a certain level of fantasy that seems to be encouraged in cultural texts about love. It's about the kind of person one relates to, the kind of relationship that one wants to have. And what ends up happening is that we become more attracted to this kind of person or this kind of relationship rather than this person or this relationship, right? When you have this kind of thing, I want to be with this kind of person, it abstracts it away from that person in particular. And if two people are having a relationship with the kind of person that they want to be with, they're not actually relating with each other at all. Does that make sense? Number three, beyond scale or questions of scale, those we interact with on a more intimate basis, we nonetheless still ignore. Consider the people who take your order at McDonald's. For those of you who, assuming that you prefer to have your cow served Big Mac style than Whopper style, however you eat cow, I don't know. Everybody eats cow around these parts. Consider the bartender. Consider the panhandler. Consider the janitor. Consider the bus driver. Consider the grocery bagger. And it's difficult. It's difficult to consider those human beings as human beings and not just a kind of person, or as a role, or as a function. It's really, really hard to see these people as individuals capable of pain. You don't want to hear about your janitor's pain. You don't want to hear about your cab driver's pain, or a policeman's pain, or a bartender's pain. Nobody wants to hear about anybody else's pain. You don't want to consider people at the level of pain. And it's especially uncomfortable to consider people when they're exploited at an economic level. Right? Low-wage workers, you sure are probably in a lot of pain. Of course they're in pain. They're working a minimum wage job that doesn't feed anybody. It's not a sustainable lifestyle. And you know that they're in pain. You don't want to hear about it. You just want your groceries bagged. And you hope it's some 17-year-old kid who has rich parents. So you just don't even have to deal with the world of reality and pain that their lives might include. You don't want to consider the person. So we tend to be okay overlooking such people, or positing that their existence begins or ends with their job. It's like that when I was in elementary school, I thought that my teachers lived there. And those few random occurrences where I tee them out in public were incredibly jarring. Like, wait, you're only, you only belong there. And that's how I consider my janitor or my grocery bagger, right? They just belong at the job, and they don't exist beyond those doors. Their lives end where my relationship with them ends. And that's as much as I want to consider them, because it's really hard to do it another way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
But aren't you talking about America now? I mean, if you go to a third world country and live in a village, it's not, there's a connection between people.
Sure.
You know their lives so that you are not looking at them as a kind of person. You know them, you know their background, you know their history. So that kind of communication with people exists in other, just
it might, but again, for me, it's like pain. I don't know, because I haven't lived that life. I don't know it. And I believe you. I don't disbelieve you. And I see what you're saying. And I want to think that that's true, the way that I want to think that a puppy suffers pain if I kick it. Right? I want to think that that's pain. It should be pain. I don't want to kick a puppy. And I want to believe that other communities have a better way of interacting morally and ethically and lovingly with one another than we do in America. And I believe that that's probably true, but I can't attest to it because I haven't lived it. Is that a fair answer? Yeah.
So, did we always live in this kind of chosen ignorance, or was there ever a time that we weren't like this? Was this just inherent to the human condition?
That's what I'm saying. No, I mean, he's talking about Americans today. I mean,
Yeah.
human beings have been living in the village and they have a completely different orientation for how many years?
We're thrown into this place. And I haven't lived in other lives. I haven't lived in other parts of it. I mean, I just don't know. And it's possible that it was better, but I also know that there's a profound desire for nostalgia, which makes everything better in the past.
Could we choose to have pockets of altruism and selflessness in this society, not going to a third world country?
Or are you talking about American Indians? Are you talking about regular Americans?
Capitalistic Western
Yeah.
first world Americans. Do we have the capacity to move beyond that?
No. I mean, utopias always fail. And every utopic society that has been set forth with great virtue and eloquence that says we're going to be better, it folds. It's hard to sustain. It's hard to consider people. And you can maybe do it at the level of a village or a neighborhood, right? You might even have a good neighborhood or a good church, like some small group that's really, really super connected.
Or in history. I mean, you can read what people talked about, how people lived in the past.
Yeah, but you can read the newspapers today and they all lie to you. Like, you never know. You never know. Again, I don't disbelieve you. But humans tend to be fallible. And humans tend to consider themselves before they consider others. And that's been something that's been pretty generally true, at least in the stuff that I've read. Maybe there are other sources too.
How about before the Greeks, before it was patriarchy,
Yeah.
Get into all that kind of thing, where it was more egalitarian thing with the women, in Crete, and men and women being more equal and not building fortresses and everything. So go before the Greeks.
And
I mean, there's
What? We really have recorded history there, and let it know enough to say that everybody was happy.
Yeah,
To
it's,
say people were happy, but they weren't fighting wars and things like
Just
that.
because there's no wars doesn't mean there's not that impersonal apathy towards communities. So it's tough to say.
I can't.
yeah, I don't know. And again, it's not that it's wrong and it's good to consider. I just don't know. I don't have access to it. It's like the lobster's pain. I can imagine it.
Excusing us by saying, oh, we don't know if that ever existed, we don't know if there's, so we're just like everyone else, and Americans are just like everyone else. I don't think that excuses.
I don't think it excuses anything either. No, I don't think it's an excuse. I just think that's what I need to consider because this is where I live and here's where I am now. And in terms of my consideration, I need to consider people better.
It might also be a comfort to think of us as the same as those other people, that maybe with some minor lifestyle changes, we could.
That's why, I mean, look at those other things. I mean, this seems very pessimistic, like we're all this way, we're all suffering, we're all, which I think it's hard not to be in this culture, but this isn't the only culture.
That's true.
And it's not the only culture that's ever existed.
That's true.
So.
That's true. Well, here's what I think the alternative is. So this might help. The alternative to pessimism. David Foster Wallace pushes his readers to consider the lobster at the level of individual physical suffering. Not just the fact that it dies, but the way that it suffers pain. He's not wanting us to love lobster, because that's something that the main lobster festival promoters want us to do, right? He wants us to consider its suffering, to become open to the fact that the lobster suffers before we eat it. And I suspect that unlearning our loneliness may require that we do something similar, to consider the suffering of those around us on a really, really particular personal level. And I think that we have the ability and capacity to do that if that's something that we consider doing as a priority. Instead of overlooking people based on their functionality to us, how they're easy or how they're convenient, you can train yourself to focus on their suffering. And I think this can help on an abstract social level. It can also help on a personal level. If you want to have a better relationship with your partner, focus on their physical sufferings, perhaps their mental or their emotional sufferings. Learn to become open to their pains and problems and vulnerable to sharing that pain with them. Their pain, like sharing the pain that they experience with them, not just telling about your pains, right? Be open to their suffering. To share pain isn't to tell those you love that their pain is temporary or that it will end soon. It's not to give that kind of empty consolation. To share pain is to really fully acknowledge that it hurts and that it isn't fair and that nothing will make it better. Too often, far too often, we attempt to protect ourselves from the suffering of others by making recourse to Hallmark-esque slogans, right? Get well soon. And there's a little teddy bear with a daisy on it or something like that. But to consider another is to consider what makes that person hurt and to be willing to face that hurt with the other in an unflinching way. And if one's successful at this, it helps the other to unlearn their loneliness. Nothing makes us feel lonely the way that suffering does, because as the narrator points out, suffering is not something that can easily be put into language. Our pain is our own. It's isolated. And it's in considering the pain of another that we can release them from their isolation and from their loneliness. Yeah.
I have this, you could call it affliction, that I can walk down the street and complete strangers will come up to me and tell me their life history, which involves a lot of pain. So maybe this has to be a collaboration.
Mm-hmm. I think for it to work, I think for it to help change the world into a better place, it has to be collaborative. But any attempt to do anything collaborative with humans is bound to fail unless it gives them money. I'm kind of pessimistic. I really kind of am. And so I apologize for those kinds of just views that I'll interject randomly. But it's hard. But what you can do is on your own, do that and help people see why it's worth it to share their pain. And hope that they're like, wow, I don't feel as lonely now. Something improved in my life and in yours through that exchange, and have them do also. And I think the only way to truly allow that to grow, in order to collaborate, is just have people experience why it's important and why it helps. Is this something that I do? At best, I'm radically inconsistent about it. But it is something I consider. And I invite you to do the same. Does the essay make more sense? Why I start with it? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Next week will be fun. Thanks for coming to speak.